workshop with NK, who's one of my dearest friends. I'm so glad to have them here today. So yeah, why don't you all welcome NK.
Presentation, at any point, if anyone wants to, I know I'm standing up here, but if you want to comment or call out at any time, or not to ask a question or to not ask a question, if something just resonates or you want to share your thoughts, please feel free at any point. And so, yeah, thank you a lot for having me this Sunday. I'm really happy to be here and talk about a topic that is very personal and has probably shaped most things in my life. So again, my name is NK. You guys can call me Natalie. And this presentation is called Heirlooms. And so a little bit about me. I am a Korean, Chinese, Malay American. Usually I am up at Han, UMC in Side Heights, so by Columbia, but I'm glad to be here today. I am also an early childhood educator and a community organizer. Thank you. And like he said, I'm actually from New Jersey too.
New Jersey.
Yeah. There's a few other characters in this presentation that are going to actually be from New Jersey too. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah. All right, so I figured we'd start with a little share out. So it is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
It's long.
So, yeah, so what comes to mind for us, how long have you known that this month has existed, and how familiar are you with these topics, the letters and the acronym? Also, my friends here, can you see the TV? Or? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, anyone want to share?
Question? I didn't get Native Hawaiian.
Yeah.
The others I knew, but the Native Hawaiian was an addition I didn't know about.
Yeah. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share
about that?
Yeah, just anything about.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of ripping on Minister Chloe's letter in the newsletter, but I mean that acronym to represent the amount of people, it's an insult.
It's ridiculous.
However, my understanding is that that was how people tried to organize to get united. So while it's incomplete and it is frustrating, that was how people tried to get political power and influence in the dominant white society. So you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, definitely a lot of my thoughts too.
When did it start? Because I'm confused, like the acronym. I feel like I first saw it in 2020. Did it exist before that?
That is a good question. So I think, do you know? Yeah, I should know this.
Was it in the 70s?
I know.
A lot of stuff happened in the 70s.
AAPI started, I know, a while ago. The thing is that I think, like, if we're talking about AA and HPI History Month, I know, like, the AA has been around for a while. PI got tacked on after, and then NH is a very recent thing, which is, yeah, a little messed up if you think about it. Especially because, like, within this group, again, like, it's not a monolith. Like, there's Asian Americans that have had conflicts with each other, and there's, all sorts of dynamics that kind of get just mixed together.
My students used to argue that the reason this was an attempt to be like Americans, because they did that because they thought of themselves as I'm Chinese, I'm Japanese, I'm not Asian, I'm very specifically of my particular place. And this was an attempt to try to do the American put you all together thing. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think anyone except for Americans really views Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders as one group. I know, like, in our community we don't really, but from the outside.
I feel like we box people to better than almost any place in the world. We put people in, we try to put people in boxes, and I don't know if that's a dominant white thing. I don't think it's necessarily done as much in Europe, but we've done it here historically. On census, we make people check boxes. And we never do nuance well at all. So Black History Month, like even within what the umbrella of Black is, could be so many different things. This attempt at putting that under one big box or umbrella is just ridiculous on its face. And yet, as Jane said, it's like you gotta start somewhere in terms of organizing to get some political power and visibility. So there's a little bit of a give and take there. But I hate the boxes. I think that, like, I've tried to resist boxes, and we're all a little bit more than what that box tries to make us. So.
I also think Asian American came about to get rid of the dreaded term Oriental, because people were called Orientals, on 68 September. And when I was in college in the 70s, my Chinese heritage Hawaiian friend said, please, you always use Asian American, because at least that worked for him. So, because Oriental was like a European word, I guess, and that was, people got called that a lot. It was one of those better terms. That's ignorant white people use.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Definitely very important. Also, one thing I forgot to mention, this presentation, it is a little bit long, so if at any point you do need to get up, to go somewhere else, or just to grab more food or drinks, feel free. I'm not offended. Yeah, hopefully this can just be casual, and then hopefully, yeah, you can learn something about what I'm going to share. So, I think what I've heard a lot about this Heritage Month in particular is that a lot of people didn't realize it existed until 2020, and didn't really start paying attention to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander issues until 2020. And I'm talking about even Asian Americans too. And that is somewhat for a good reason. I mean, a lot happened that year. And a lot of it is thanks to the president around that time, who was putting out these tweets that were proven to have a direct correlation with an increase in outward bigotry and discrimination. And we took note. So this was from a study a couple years ago, where you can see in the top, yeah, Asian Americans are overwhelmingly able to identify Donald Trump as the most responsible for the rise in perceived discrimination, racism, and violence in the past few years. In 2021, we saw the Stop Asian Hate movement, which was in response to a lot of that continuation of anti-Asian sentiment even after Trump left office and Biden took over. In November 2021, and these are just things that happened in New York City. Vee Ma was assaulted in Jackson Heights and passed away a year later. In January 2022, Michelle Go was murdered at a subway station in February. Just a month later, Christina Yuna Lee, who actually went to my college just a few years before me, was attacked at her home in Chinatown. And I know that these things are vastly underreported, because even just talking to my friends, like, we've had experiences that they didn't report. I had one friend who got a concussion because they were, someone punched him in the head on the train, and then just left. And she never reported that. A lot of these things are never reported. And some people say, like, this is all Trump's fault. This is all part of Trump's legacy. But really, the reality is that this issue existed far before Trump. So when I hear that, like, oh, this is all Trump's fault, I kind of have to say, like, well, this has been around a lot longer than 2020. Whether it was the killing of Vincent Chin by white auto workers in Detroit, the Los Angeles Chinese massacre in 1871, which was historians actually call the biggest mass lynching in American history, and the KKK attacking Vietnamese fishermen in Texas because they were scared of their jobs being taken, and then Of course, you have the classic racist tropes and xenophobia dating back to the 1800s when immigration first started. So in response to Stop Asian Hate in 2021, we saw, the government giving some, I don't know what to call it, nice gestures. So for example, this COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which, and then we also have, I think that's, Biden signing in this law in the top right, and then a year later, this is from Asian American Pacific Islander Month last year, him inviting the boy band BTS to the White House, a South Korean band, to talk about anti-Asian hate in the United States.
All right. How literally performative.
Right. And so, we have to ask, as our own community, but also people outside the community have to ask, is this really the solution that we want? Last week, I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, Ron DeSantis in Florida signed a bill in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander History Month to include Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander curriculum in the public schools. And that's coming at a time when AP African American Studies has been rejected by the same governor, by the same politicians, when critical race theory is under attack, when books are being taken out of Florida school libraries. And so we really, looking to the same people that are doing these things for a solution, I'm not really sure that's the way to go, and I'm really glad that there's been a lot of Asian Americans calling out victims of either police brutality or the criminal justice system. They're asking us to trust the same government that pushed all these yellow peril narratives back in the 1800s, opened internment camps for the Japanese, banned Muslims from entering the US, constantly tearing apart families. When I was in Arizona a few years ago at the border, I actually learned that the bail that's typically set in ICE detention centers when they catch you at the border is typically around $8,000. And this is clearly a for-profit scheme because for Chinese immigrants, they set the bail at $70,000. Constant gentrification and eviction in our neighborhoods, and the US military poisoning the water and our natural resources in the Pacific Islands. So the reality is that this sort of anti-Asian violence has really existed far before the conception of the term hate crime. We're never going to shake our relish for raising the specter of outsiders because this is really part of the national myth of this country. And now in the news, you're going to see reports of street violence and bigotry, but really these are just branches or even leaves on a much, much bigger tree. And I always felt weird about using the term hate crime because that word hate to me sounds like it's just an emotional sort of a strong emotion that makes you really dislike something, when really it's part of an entire machine. Like all of this is structural, in my opinion. And so that tree that's causing all of this, it doesn't just appear out of nowhere. For example, the slur goop, that came from foreign policy. That was even though people mostly associate it with the Vietnam War, it actually started in the 40s in Korea. So now people think like, these slurs exist, people are being racist, but where exactly did that come from? And I think this country does a really good job of hiding that history, and I do think it is intentional. I mean, if you look at the Asian American studies that kind of came out in academia in the 60s and the 70s, it was intentionally split from the history of Asian history, right? So Asian American studies was made different than Asian studies. So this was, I really do think this was intentional because a lot of the truths that we have to realize go beyond Asian America and back to our home countries where we came from. So growing up, I had another Korean friend, and we were catching up about a year ago, and he mentioned to me like, yeah, you know, like I don't really feel like I have a right to speak on like all this racism stuff because you know, it didn't really affect me that badly. You know, I'm still fine. I turned out okay, but you know, I had to ask like, why are you here in this country in the first place? You're a Korean like I am, and your parents are traumatized just like mine are. So really, how can you say that this doesn't affect you? So my family, on my mom's side, like I said, we are a mixed Chinese Malay. So we're from here and here. The Chinese side of my family is from Guangxi, and then I have other family members from the Malaysian Peninsula, and they ended up coming over to the US in the 70s. And they were always, you know, fairly open about their family story and what had happened and where they'd come from. Now, my father's side is the Korean side. And that was a little harder to navigate. You know, I would always find very, very contradictory things in what they were telling me. So, for example, like my grandma, she would kind of sarcastically say like North Korea is bad Korea and South Korea is good Korea, and then there was like this sarcasm in her voice. Same thing, my grandpa was actually a poet in Korea, and then after he passed away, I started translating some of his poetry, and there were these, he was writing about Wall Street and how like their souls were gray, which I never knew that side of him. When he was alive. So, and then whenever I did press for details, you know, it was always kind of just like, we're just here because of the war, and they never really talked about it much. So, that history I really had to go out and learn on my own. So, I think most people, when they think of, you know, what is Korean history? A lot of people obviously know or I guess don't know the Forgotten War, which is the Korean War that officially took place from 1950 to 1953. It was only 5 years after the end of Japanese imperialism. They only had 5 years before the war started. North versus South, and then on July 1953, the war didn't end. They signed an armistice that paused the fighting, and that's where you see the DMZ today. But actually, this year, 2023, is the 70th anniversary of the war. So this war has been going on for 70 years.
The monument in Brooklyn is about 2 blocks from here, in Cadman Plaza. It has all the names of the guys from Brooklyn that died there. But there's no recognition of the loss in Korea, which I've always felt. Vietnam memorials and Korea memorials that I've ever visited, they should recognize the broader context as well as the local loss. Right. But it's not that far away, and they have all the names of. I try to visit it somewhat regularly, but it's interesting that it's right there, but nobody even knows it's there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's still called Forgotten.
Right.
So, if you looked up this war online, you're gonna probably see something that looks like this. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica. So, it's the standard narrative. In 1950, the North invaded the South, and the U.S. Came to the rescue. And these are just from that same Encyclopedia Britannica entry. I don't know if you guys can see there, but basically there is, a little section that asks, how was the US involved? And this page is saying, the US was involved in rebuilding Korea after the Japanese left the occupation, when the Japanese left the peninsula after their occupation. And they were working with the UN, your standard thing. And on the right, you see, after 1945, after the Japanese left, the Soviet Union came and purged the zone of political dissidents. Yeah, again, pretty standard narrative that you would see if you were to look up what happened, what was the Korean War. I think this was maybe the first or second result. I'll come back to this later, after I finish talking. But the first thing I always think when I see this type of narrative is that the war really didn't start in 1950. So it was actually divided on August 14th, one day before the Japanese surrendered in World War II. And it was divided so that, only to facilitate that ending, only to facilitate that surrender. So these two men, these two US generals, they literally sat in a room with a National Geographic map, and they, over one night, decided this is where we're gonna, I think this makes sense. So Seoul, they literally said, I think Seoul should belong to the US because it's the capital, so let's just go 30 miles above that. And that's how the country was divided, over one night. So they sent the telegraph to the USSR, and they accepted it 2 days later. And even before the war broke out, so over the next few years, that same border eventually became more and more hardened. Ground transit was closed. Eventually that turned into even radio and phone contact being illegal. And again, in that period between 1945 and 1950, a lot of people I think don't know this, but again, this is before the war even started. In that supposed period of non-war, 100,000 Koreans died.
Were they executed?
There's a lot of different reasons. I'll cover a bit of that in the next few slides. But yeah, really, so in 1945, again, we saw the Japanese leave in August, and the Americans came to occupy the South less than a month later, and the USSR actually came to occupy the North even sooner than that. So really, they had less than a month before anyone else came. Yeah.
Wasn't it consistent with the fight going on between the Soviet Union and America? So Korea is part of that. Germany, when they broke it up too, was part of that. Isn't that all part of the political thing that was happening between communism and American?
So what's interesting is that this is actually a little bit, this is technically before what people think of as the Cold War. So this is still in the 40s. Mm-hmm. A lot of the conflicts in Vietnam, for example, or in like Afghanistan happened so much later. And a lot of scholars have looked back and said that the reason why those conflicts happened was because they got the template from Korea. Because it was forgotten, these powers figured out like this is going to be the way things go from now on. So we're starting in 1945 when the Japanese surrendered. And so what I've heard from relatives and friends of relatives is that you can literally look out the window and see their ships leaving. So I know like out here in the West, like we think like of these terms, war, surrender, peace treaty, and these are just abstract things on a paper. But what this really looks like, again, like they literally just picked up their things and left. Like a lot of elderly Koreans were school children at this time, and they have told me like on that day, like we ran to the windows and just looked outside and saw their boats leaving the shore. Mm-hmm. There was no sort of facilitation. Again, the factories, which were 90% owned by the Japanese imperialists, they literally just left everything where it was and took off. A lot of extended family of mine were living in Shanghai during the time, and where there was a lot of Korean refugees living there. There was a Koreatown in Shanghai at the time, and what they told me about that day in August 1945, like it was just everyone just stopped what they were doing. Everyone came out of work, school, just started hugging, crying, and immediately mobilizing to fill in the gaps where the Japanese left. So in Shanghai, right, the Japanese, they would import boys from Korea that were in their teens to basically be house servants for them. So immediately after they left, I have one friend whose father was a chemical engineer, just got these huge like barrels of, I don't know what mixture it was, but he would fill it with the solutions basically to clean these boys. And every single day they would walk out into the fields and find 7, 8, just try to gather as many as they could, bring them back, clean them off. They had them all sleeping on the floor in their living room. And then they would try to organize boats to bring them back to Korea. And what they did was, at that time there was just one radio. They would call Korea every day and just say, hey, these people, all they had were their names, what towns they were from. They would say, these people from these towns, they're arriving, they're gonna arrive today. So hopefully they can get back. And then there was, again, this explosion of people organizing in the gaps where the previous. And then ultimately they ended up forming the Korean People's Republic, which was, again, this is before the Americans had a chance to arrive. And so, 87 leaders from various political tendencies were selected. And just to show you how strong the spirit of consensus was, they had both Kim Il-sung, the future ruler of North Korea, and Syngman Rhee, the future president of South Korea, or future dictator of South Korea, both in that board of 87 leaders. So that's how strong the spirit of consensus was. There was a leftist and a conservative, both together. People really had hope that through cooperation, things would be worked out. And like I said, so when the Japanese just left their stuff there and got out, and what this actually did was create a huge opportunity for restructuring, especially with economic relations. So almost immediately you saw, with that explosion of unions and workers' councils, they took over the factories and started running things, which is, so when the US came, they actually said that in one of the provinces, for an instance where they were able to survey, 42 out of 50 were running smoothly, and sometimes even exceeding the level of production that they had during the colonial era. And again, if you think about how fast that happened, and if you think about your country has been colonized and you've had no chance to freely breathe or organize, and then just overnight you're able to get this together, it's truly amazing. So, on the right you see a picture of the OSS in Vietnam, spring 1945. So what's interesting is that, the US and Vietnam, as well as the US and Korea, were all allies during World War II against the Japanese. Again, Kim Il-sung, who was going to be America's biggest enemy in just a few years, they were actually allies. And Kim Il-sung would call the American planes the good planes, and the Japanese planes the bad planes. Likewise, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, looking to their former allies for help, actually wrote a letter to President Truman asking to make Vietnam a protectorate of the US like Puerto Rico. So,
not a good thing either.
Again, this changed really, really quickly. We know what happened in Vietnam, but in Korea, in just a few months, everything that I mentioned before, the people's committees, the people's government, all the trade unions were made illegal. Everyone who was in them were arrested. By 1947, the US actually had more Korean political prisoners than the Japanese did. The Japanese had about 14,000, and the US had over 20,000, I think about 21,000. The only difference, and they were in the same buildings too, the only difference is that the Americans ran them more efficiently. As many as 80% of the policemen and security forces from the Japanese era, literally just switched their paychecks to American paychecks. They were the same people, Some of them were even allowed to keep their uniforms. And then August 15th, again, the day that Koreans got independence, those celebrations were outlawed, except for the ones organized by the US.
Because August 15th was known as Victory over Japan Day, I think that Rhode Island may celebrate it until very recently, which is bizarre, but.
So instead of trying to cooperate and work with whatever organs of power were existing in Korea, the U.S. Army and military government was essentially just imposed on the peninsula. President Truman openly admitted he knew nothing. No one in the state military or State Department could speak Korean. And so, yeah, there's kind of a running joke that it was the translators that were actually running the country. And just to give you some backdrop on the future unrest, where did those 100,000 deaths come from? It was just unrest in those 5 years. So, massive inflation. Rice was 100 times the price than it was before the Americans showed up. Food collection, distribution. We think that the USSR is the only government that ever collected food. Well, the US was collecting food too. They were ordering the Korean policemen to go to the farmers and collect rice to supposedly ration it out, but people actually found that many of those police stations were hoarding rice and grain in their homes. And so again, this was the backdrop for many of the protests and uprisings you're going to see in the next few years. And rather than devote resources to people's needs, so for example, there was a big cholera epidemic, again, food, healthcare, and again, this mirrors a lot what we see today. Instead of devoting resources to that, the America, I guess, yeah, their overarching theme was instead to just give more guns to the policemen. All these Korean policemen, for some reason, had American weapons. How did that happen? So, the agenda was pretty clear. I think that first quote really shows how clear, or I guess what the American agenda really was, which was, we have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without compromising our national security. That was a State Department memo from 1948. So again, we don't have to connect the dots. They're telling us what's going on. And then again, before the war starts, U.S. General John Reed Hodge, who was in charge of the USAMGIK, the military government, says, the best way to describe Southern Korea at present is to state that they are in a powder keg ready to explode upon application of the spark. Koreans have not understood why they were not given complete independence and allowed to establish completely their own government within 2 to 3 days of the arrival of the Americans. So again, it's not ignorance. They are saying they know exactly what's going on. It's not ignorance.
And hardly anybody in the American military probably spoke or understood Korean.
Yeah.
Based on what?
So yeah, a lot of the military, they were trained for, actually a lot of the Americans that ended up getting sent to Korea were trained for duty in Japan or the Philippines.
Right, so they knew Japanese but not Korean. So
yeah, I guess, again, going back to that whole, Asian Americans are just one group, they decided, yeah, what's the difference if we send them to Korea instead? So again, we have this hunger, mismanagement, healthcare, and corruption in this new U.S. military government, which really sets the context for what's going to happen in one of the biggest uprisings in October 1946. And what this started as was a rail strike that eventually became a general strike. And it started out just asking for better conditions, but after the police started firing on the crowd and killing people, it morphed into an uprising. And at that point, it stopped being about just better conditions. And they started making political demands too. So things like an end to the military government, transfer of power to the people's committees, and to make not make them illegal anymore. The actions of the protests, including seizing food from the police, like I mentioned before, so the people that were hoarding grain, and actually in some cases were selling it to Japan. they would occupy police buildings and destroy tax records. And then also, because the US was not providing any avenues for justice against the former imperialists, there was a lot of direct action against former Japanese moderators. And again, the American response isn't that different than what we see in this country. For example, with what happened in the 60s, the 70s, even in more recent times, for example, in 2020, it's the same pattern of just responding with more force, sending in US troops and tanks. Hundreds of Koreans died, 0 Americans did. Which just goes to show that the KPR still thought that they had a chance of negotiating and cooperating. They really thought, the US and the Soviet Union, they promised, and the other great powers too, England, China, they promised independence, and the Koreans really took that to heart. So this just goes to show how much discipline there was and how much optimism people still had in 1946. And I don't know if you've read the quotes already, but the first one is from an American in the Department of Transportation, and the second quote is from a US soldier writing to President Truman because he felt it was so necessary to make sure the president knew what exactly was going on. So I'm going to skip a little bit to the next uprising, or I guess the next big event in this 1945 to 1950s period, which was on Jeju Island. And I thought I would share this because I recently picked up this book that wrote about what life on that island was like, and it's fascinating because this was basically a matrifocal island of female divers where it was, the men didn't. This is what it looks like today.
Surprise.
So a young girl starts to play in the water when she's about 5 years old. Within a few years, she will have taught herself to swim and dive for game underwater. Even among children, skillful swimming and diving are sources of pride. By the time she goes to middle school, a girl is ready to ask her mother for diving equipment. She dives with her friends in a protected area. Her mother teaches her how to use her arms and hands to plunge, how to cut plants from their roots without killing the plants. From her summer diving, a girl earns her own school tuition and pocket money. After middle school graduation, when she's about 15, she starts diving seriously. She learns underwater geography and ocean currents. She learns to plot her diving strategy by the moon's movement, and she knows where to look for game. By the age of 20, a woman is finally considered a regular diver. By the time she reaches 25, she will have saved up enough money to start a family, and many women stop making diving trips after marriage. Companionship is very important in the diving culture. Divers spend what may seem to be an unnecessarily long time changing their clothes, but it is a joyful time when they can exchange information, talk about their family problems, joke, and sometimes sing. A 66-year-old woman who no longer dove said, "After my friends are gone, I feel so bored and lonesome. I'll go down to the beach tomorrow to joke, laugh, and be with my friends." So again, we can see just from the account in this book that there really was a sort of communal, a long communal tradition that was established on this island. And again, this is not on the mainland, so the people here were relatively left alone when the Americans first arrived. But in 1948, there was, it kind of took a turn when there were, the US says that they were just, and the US and the UN wanted to have elections to establish a formal government in the country, which doesn't sound so bad until you realize that these elections would basically solidify two separate governments because they couldn't come to an agreement about how the elections should proceed. So if these elections were to happen, then there would be an independent government government in the south, and so a lot of Koreans, again, seeing through the lines, saw this was going to be a permanent division of the country. And so on Jeju Island, that was one of the biggest protests against that election. Right-wing police were imported from the mainland, and people really tried their hardest not to vote, to the point where actually on that island they had the lowest voter turnout for this election. We can probably guess what happened in response, simply because they didn't want to vote to form what they thought was an illegitimate government. So at this point, Seung-Ri has been made the president. He was actually a Korean who was in exile, conservative Korean who was in exile, Harvard educated, and lived in Princeton, New Jersey. And they flew him over on an American plane and installed him as the first president of South Korea. So in this, as soon as he took over, trees and bushes were uprooted, lands were cleared. And again, this is so significant because of the connection people had with the land. As I read from this book, and again, from knowing the terrain, people knew how to, hide in the mountains to avoid being taken to the elections. The US said that they were fighting communism, that they were fighting armed communists, but there were 500 guerrilla fighters and 30,000 deaths. 40,000 Koreans fled to Japan. Imagine how bad things have to be to go back to your former colonizers. And in fact, there's still issues with the Korean population in Japan today. The Zainichi Korean population is still targeted for discrimination in Japan. And there's also been accounts of Japanese saying that there were Korean bodies washing up on shore within this year during the winter slaughter.
I have a question. When we're talking about Asian American, Hawaiian, total not use that, isn't the difficulty because how is it for young people between the Japanese and the Koreans? Because of that history you just mentioned, it's hard to be lumped together, as you said, with the colonizers. And they were colonizers for a pretty long time and did tremendously horrible things. So how is it, do you think, I know I'm running ahead, but I'm curious as to what you think about that.
It's really tough because I guess this is really the problem with always having the white American gaze on you, and why I think it's so important to have spaces dedicated just for Asian Americans, because we really do need our own space to talk about these issues, right? So yes, the Japanese were colonizers of Korea, but Koreans were also enlisted by the Americans to go fight in Vietnam. They actually said that a lot of those Korean troops were more brutal than the Americans were. And same thing, and then that's not even getting started with the Pacific Islands, where there are a lot of Asians that are colonizers of these Pacific Islands and of Hawaii. So really, I think a lot of at least my friends kind of share the sentiment of we have things to discuss amongst each other that we really need to talk about, but don't let the white people see.
Gotcha.
Because otherwise, what they see is that we're all Chinese, and I've experienced it myself where it's we're trying to have inter-dialogue in our community, but as soon as someone above us gets hold of it, that's going to be weaponized for racism or for further oppression. So it sucks. It's a double consciousness sort of, where it's you always
Africans and African Americans had issues to the Caribbean. So got it.
Yeah. Kind of running short on time, so I think I might skip this, but if you want to read the quote at the bottom, it's very clear what was happening on the peninsula during that time. I think I'm going to skip the, Okay, let's just go here. So I guess like one of the last points I want to make is how this is shown up, how this legacy of what happened back in the 40s and 50s shows up today. And so again, if we're gonna think about what most people's narratives about the war was, like, okay, in 1950 the North invaded the South, and then the U.S. helped the South. Like that's the narrative we hear. But as we've seen, like the conflict didn't start in 1950. It started years before that. And as well, this fixation on who invaded who, I don't know, we don't do that for any other war. Like we evaluate what the two sides were, right? Like the American Civil War, no one's saying like, okay, who invaded who? If you're the bad guy, no, you're supposed to look at the two sides and see what they were fighting for. And I think just in general, a lot of scholars in recent years have challenged the idea that this was even a civil war in the first place. So, for example, if it was a civil war, then who were the equivalents of Lee and Grant to Stonewall Jackson and William Sherman? Whether we seek an answer in South Korean or U.S. histories, movies, and public monuments, we inevitably come across U.S. generals, not Korean ones. MacArthur, Ridgway, Walton, Harris, Walker, after whom a Sheraton Hotel and Casino in Seoul are still named. The prominence of U.S. generals in the Korean Civil War is no accident, since Syngman Rhee gave the United States complete operational control of the South Korean troops and police. Rhee did not bring MacArthur to Korea to help with the war. MacArthur bought Rhee from New Jersey, from the United States, on one of the US military planes reserved for MacArthur's personal use. And so really, like when I think about this war and how it looks today and what sort of legacy it's left, what I see is a US bullying a small country into devastation and then blaming the victim. And in fact, for Koreans, this was an apocalypse of sorts.
Absolutely. And it's so depressing. I mean, Dean Rush was one of the failed advisors to JFK and Lyndon Johnson. So he did horrible things with the Koreans and then carried many of those attitudes probably to his next position as Secretary of State. So a legacy of not having a clue about what people in Asia wanted.
Yeah, so again, when I look at things like this, or this, it's just, the story is not there again. Yeah, on June 1950, the North just decided to invade the South. The U.S. was involved in the Reconstruction. It sounds good, but it's like, that's like saying, like Andrew Johnson was a hero of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Like, come on.
Instead of the villain.
So until 1992, I think a lot of people don't realize, especially in my generation, that South Korea was a series of dictatorships for decades and decades and decades. And the only way to get people out of power was by mass protests, revolts, or military coups. I guess one of the most prominent of those dictators was Chun Doo-hwan, who was trained by the US military and was the subject of the Gwangju uprising in 1980. I really recommend looking into this. It was just like, people are just starting to talk about it. People are just starting to be allowed to talk about it in the past couple of decades. So really, this was, I think, one of the most incredible, truly democratic movements that we've seen in modern history. People have described it as absolute community. People would just cook in the streets and give out food every single day. Bus drivers and taxi drivers would coordinate to block off roads for protests, transport the wounded, and money was pretty much non-existent for the days where this commune existed. And it's inspired a lot of art since then. It just shows you what it's like in the Korean political consciousness. And I'm sure we can all guess the response again. And through some, I highly recommend following the journalist Tim Shorrock. He's done a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests to get more information about the US's involvement in this massacre. And we've actually seen that President Carter did indeed give the green light to use force on the protesters. And again, we Koreans are only just recently being able to talk about this and to acknowledge what happened. With one example being the spirit marriages in 2018. So for 3 days, a shaman in Korea held an afterlife marriage ceremony where 2 souls in the form of puppets were dressed in robes and ritualized to. And nowadays it's typical to see maybe candlelight vigils or similar events each year. And yeah, so this should give some context when you see anti-American sentiment in Korea. We to this day still have military bases, provocative war drills, sanctions on half the peninsula, and the thing is that this is all interconnected, right? So those military bases, and there's decades and decades of Korean women basically being forced into prostitution by their own government, collaborating with the US government. And they follow, if the military base moves, these towns move too. And this is still happening today. And you see this not only with Koreans, but also poor Russian women and Filipinos are also, again, being swept into this. Massive cultural harm of white supremacy, and also there's massive unresolved generational trauma throughout Korea and the diaspora. So again, the church I go to is called Han, and that's actually a Korean word that kind of means, there's no direct translation, but it's supposed to refer to just like the anguish and melancholy and agitation, just a mixture of all that Korean people carry in their souls and their spirits. That feeling of just being stuck and downtrodden and having your neck stepped on, but also having some sort of power being able to come out of that. Okay, I'm gonna skip this, but let's see. Okay. I do recommend watching this. Not sure if we have time for that, but just for an example of how this sort of, ideological imperialism is continuing today. Yeah, the famous Gangnam Style rapper Psy was forced to apologize to Obama for performing at a protest, right, against American presence in South Korea. And people said like, oh, he was too angry. He had a tank and like smashed it on stage and everyone was cheering. The context they didn't give was that 2 days before the performance, an American tank ran over 2 Korean schoolgirls and killed them. And yeah, he was forced to apologize in order to come perform in the US. So I think similar to what we heard in our sermon today, there's a lot we can learn. So what does it mean to be in communion? What does that look like? And again, what can we learn from people? What can we learn about revolution? What can we learn from the same people that have actually lived through apocalypse and resurrection and had to struggle and be in communion to fight against empire? What should our political participation look like? So in the 1960s, after the first president of South Korea was overthrown, an average of 3,900 people were in the streets of Seoul every single day. So yeah, what can we learn from that? What has to change here? What does real democracy look like? What can we learn from moments in history like Gwangju? Can we imagine other forms of political power besides what we have now, besides what Western culture has taught us? Again, one of the reasons why the Americans, one of the reasons the Americans gave for installing their military government was, quote unquote, a lack of parliamentary tradition, which really just speaks of ignorance to recognize all these non-state forms of organization throughout Asia and other parts of the world. And I think no matter who you are, you can learn a lot from your ancestors too. Because I remember, the picture at the bottom right is one of my favorites. This is actually in New York on one of the bridges where my grandparents would just go to the pylons and fish and scoop mussels off the side. And, you know, this got me thinking, like, why is food locked up in a supermarket? Why are people going hungry? Like, why are there no more food forests? Why can't we get our food ourselves? And I think, yeah, we talked about this a lot at the beginning, but how, as Americans, you know, in the center of all of this, what can we do, and then how do we do our part? Because ultimately, this is all connected. I have no doubt in my mind that the tactics that were used in Korea were first perfected on Indigenous Americans, on Black Americans, and then on the flip side, brought back over. So all those protests, all those demonstrations, that was just another opportunity to again, perfect these methods, to perfect that procedure of just giving more guns to the police. You know, people have actually found, you know, the US actually goes to other countries and teaches them how to build prisons. At the end of this slide, or at the very last slide actually has an article about that. I think this is going to be shared later, or I can send this out somehow. But yeah, and then again, same thing, our torture techniques in the Iraq War, that was perfected here in prisons too. So again, no matter what you are fighting, whether it's to close Rikers, to close the MDC in Sunset Park, or to if you're involved in Stop Cop City in Atlanta, this is all, like, it's not just about Atlanta or New York or Rikers. Like, this travels everywhere. And likewise, what happens overseas comes back to us. But even though bad things can kind of diffuse and spread around, so can a lot of really positive things. So, for example, I found this quote from Tom Hayden where he directly cites the South Koreans overthrowing their first president as his inspiration for starting the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Okay, so I think, yeah, that's the end of the presentation portion. Again, these slides can be sent out, shared. There's a few things that I couldn't get to, but for the workshop, basically, yeah, so if you want to, there are a few clickable links. So if you want to maybe have it on your phone, you can scan a QR code, but it's not necessary. You just might have to do more manual typing. But basically, I was thinking for today, we could, there are a few things I think that we need our help on, and use our support. So the first one is a bill that's on the national level called the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And I think every progressive Korean American in New York City has this as probably the highest priority right now. So this act would ask the State Department essentially to start pursuing negotiations instead of provocation of North Korea, to hopefully pursue a peace agreement. But I think most importantly, it asks for a review on the travel ban to the north. That travel ban was instated by President Trump, and it was only supposed to, I guess the term of it was only 2 years, but it was reinstated by President Biden. So Americans, especially Korean Americans, still cannot travel to North Korea to attend funerals, to see their elderly loved ones and their families. And again, a lot of people were, you know, when the armistice was signed, like whatever side of the border you were on, that was just the side you were on. So there's people that are split up, and so I think one of the biggest, most important things, one of the most tangible things of getting this bill passed is to review those that travel restriction. So this is the only, I think this is the only national level piece of legislation that I have. So, what? Not to hang up, I think like you can set it up on table. So, actually, I can set it up later. But basically, if you have the document open, I just have printed out copies here. So yeah, for the national level bills, basically what you want to do is find the name of your representative if you don't already know them. There is like a search feature on that bullet point 1. That's a search feature to find their name. Check if, I assume most people here are from New York. Check if they're currently a co-sponsor, though I think the only 2 New York representatives that are currently co-sponsoring this bill are the district for Albany and then the district for like Upper Manhattan, Harlem, South Bronx.
Okay, well, we got Dan a lot of us live in Dan Goldman's district.
Okay, yeah.
And he's supposed to be the justice guy, so.
Yeah, so that is, oh, I should mention, these are different options of what you can do for this workshop. So that is option 1. Option 2, so in Flushing, Queens, Assemblyman Aubrey has proposed to basically convert the space around the city field into a casino, which a lot of people have complained about because there's already so many issues with gambling addictions in our immigrant communities. There's already gentrification and displacement, so we want to get this casino stopped.
Okay.
And so for these I'm moving into New York State now. So for New York State, it's a little bit easier for that. You can just go on to the New York State Senate website and find the page for the number of the bill that you want to either support or oppose. And there's literally like a square that says, do you support this bill, yes or no? You can just click yes or no. Fill out your name, address, and optional short message. And yeah, same thing, the same goes for this, Assembly Bill 6579. Also the New York Senate, it works the same way. You would just press that yes or no button to require our history to be taught in New York public state schools. The important thing for this is please do put a message asking for the stuff that you learned here today to be included, and not just Asian American history. Like we want to learn about the history of US imperialism and US policy in Asia as well. And then lastly, on the city level, I think this was probably the biggest Asian American protest of 2022, which is to stop the Chinatown mega jail and instead use that $8 billion to invest in things like housing, mental health, job training, and community organizations. So for that, again, that is on the city level, and then you could write to Mayor Adams or any members of City Hall. And I have all their emails on these sheets. You can also see it on that site. And again, so from what I understand on how all this reaching out to your representatives work is that especially the higher level you go, so national especially, what they do is essentially tally up the fors and against that they receive from people. So if you write an email, somebody in their staff is going to tally up how many people from each side, right, in support or opposition, so it kind of does matter. And then usually what they'll do is compile a list of arguments for both sides. So keeping it straightforward and having clear points, even using bullet points is fine. It'll probably be effective. And yeah, okay, that is the end. So I think for the piece on the Korean Peninsula activity, I'll put it on these 2 tables here if you want to see the physical sheets, but if you want to use your tokens, it's also, that'll also work, and then the other 2 I'll put on these 2 tables.
Thank you so much.
So if you take the printouts, you can take, and please the laminated ones, we need for either your Connor to keep them. Okay.
to say, like, just as Natalie's finishing up, I think, you know, some people might need to take off or whatever. For those of us that want to hang out, we can work on this. The link, you know, you all have access to that. I'll also send it out in an email with the recording of this presentation as well as the PowerPoint. But I just want to give Natalie another thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.